still remember the way the wine glass felt in my hand when the conversation shifted. I hadn't even taken a sip yet. My boyfriend's father had just said very casually, the way someone says something they've said 1,000 times and never once had anyone push back on. The problem with young architects today is they don't understand what buildings are actually for. I set the glass down. My boyfriend, I'll call him Callum because that's his name, reached under the table and found my knee, a small pressure. Not a warning exactly, more like, I know, I see it, just wait. We were at his parents' house in Oakville, about 40 minutes outside Toronto. It was a Saturday in late October, one of those days where the light goes golden just before it disappears entirely, and his mother had made a roast that smelled incredible from the moment we walked through the door. The house was beautiful, not showy beautiful, comfortable beautiful, the kind of home that takes decades to accumulate, books on actual shelves, a dog-eared copy of something by Robertson Davies on the side table, framed photos that weren't arranged for guests but just lived there, naturally, the way family photos should. His father, I'll call him Gordon because that's also his name, was a retired structural engineer. He'd spent 30 years at a firm in downtown Toronto, worked on a handful of projects that I knew well, had a reputation that had followed him into retirement the way reputations do when they're earned rather than manufactured. He was the kind of man who had an opinion about every building he'd ever walked into, and not in an insufferable way. In a way that was honestly interesting, until it wasn't. They designed for magazine spreads, he continued, refilling his glass without asking if anyone else wanted more. Everything is about the photograph. Nobody asks whether a person actually wants to spend 8 hours a day inside the thing. Callum's mother, Irene, smiled the smile of a woman who had heard this particular speech before and had made peace with it. I had not yet had the chance to make peace with it. That's a fair criticism of some work, I said. My voice came out more measured than I felt. Though I'd argue the field is a lot broader than what ends up in the design press. Gordon looked at me, not unkindly, but with that particular tilt of the head that means someone is deciding how seriously to take you. We had been together for 2.5 years, Callum and I. His parents lived 40 minutes away, and this was the first time I was meeting them properly, sitting down at a table, passing bread, the whole thing. There had been reasons for the delay, my schedule mostly. The last 2 years had been the busiest of my life, and not in a way I could easily explain without it sounding like I was bragging, which was the last thing I wanted to do the first time I sat down with his family. I'm a licensed architect. I have been for 6 years. For the last 14 months, I have been the principal of my own firm, a small studio in the Distillery District. 7 people, work that has gotten us noticed in ways I still feel slightly surreal about. Before that, I spent 4 years at one of the largest architecture firms in the country, and before that, this is the part that's relevant, I spent 2 years as a junior architect at Gordon's old firm. Not just his old firm, his specific department. I had never met him. He'd retired the year I joined, but I knew his name. I knew his reputation. I knew the projects he'd left behind and the institutional memory of him that still lingered in conference rooms and project files. And I knew, because this is a small industry and people talk, that he had some thoughts about the direction the firm had taken after he left. I had been part of that direction. I hadn't said any of this yet. The field is broad, sure, Gordon said in the tone of someone who is agreeing with you in order to redirect you. But the culture of the field, that's what I'm talking about. The awards, the press, the whole ecosystem that tells young architects what success looks like. It's all pointing the wrong direction. I spent 30 years watching it drift. Where do you think it drifted? I asked. He seemed pleased by the question. People like Gordon are always pleased when you ask them to elaborate. Away from the user, he said. Away from the actual human experience of a space. Toward abstraction. Toward concept. I used to sit in presentations and watch these young architects talk about narrative and dialogue between structure and void. He made a small gesture with his hand that managed to dismiss an entire generation. And I'd think, but does the person who works in this building feel safe? Do they feel calm? Can they find the bathroom without a map? Callum laughed a little nervously. Irene got up to check on something in the kitchen. Those aren't mutually exclusive things, I said. Good architecture can be conceptually interesting and functionally excellent. They're not in opposition. In theory, no. In practice. In practice, I'd argue it depends entirely on who's doing the work and whether they're asking the right questions at the right stage of the process. He paused, just briefly. You're an architect? He said. I am. Where do you practice? I run a studio in the distillery district. We're small, 7 people, but we've been fairly busy. What kind of work? Mixed. We've done a community recreation center in Scarborough, a library branch in Hamilton, some residential, mostly medium density, a seniors residence in Guelph that we're particularly proud of. He nodded slowly, the way someone nods when they're recalibrating, not conceding anything yet, but adjusting their footing. Community work, he said, and the way he said it was not dismissive, exactly, but weighted. Like community work occupied a particular shelf in his taxonomy, a respectable shelf but not the top one. Mostly, I said, though the Guelph project got shortlisted for the Governor General's Medal last year. That landed differently. I hadn't meant it as a point to score. I'd mentioned it because it was true and because it was relevant, but I watched something shift in his expression, a small recalibration. That's the residential category? He asked. No, the overall category. Irene came back from the kitchen and set a dish of roasted carrots on the table. She had the easy movement of a woman who'd spent decades hosting and genuinely enjoyed it. Gordon, she said, are you talking architecture again? We're having a conversation, he said. You're having a lecture, she said pleasantly. There's a difference. She smiled at me. He does this. I apologize on his behalf. No apology needed, I said, and I meant it, mostly. Gordon had the grace to look slightly abashed. He refilled his glass, took a piece of bread, and was quiet for a moment. Then he looked up. The Guelph project, he said, the seniors' residence. Which firm? My own, Quiet Grace Studio. I said it simply, no preamble. He went still. It wasn't a dramatic stillness. It wasn't a movie moment. It was just a pause. The kind of pause that happens when someone's brain is doing something important and the rest of them has to wait. Quiet Grace, he repeated. Yes. He set his bread down. I read the write-up on that project in the Canadian Architect last spring. That was a nice piece, I said. The approach to light, the way you handled the south-facing corridors to reduce institutional feeling. He stopped himself. He was speaking as someone who knew what he was talking about, not as someone performing knowledge. That was thoughtful work. Thank you. It was a long process. The residence committee was involved at every stage, which made it slower, but better. He looked at me for a moment, just looked. You started that firm yourself? Yes, 14 months ago. Before that, I told him the firm. His eyes did something I hadn't quite seen them do before in the hour we'd been sitting at this table, something that might have been recognition, or respect, or both. I left that firm in. The year before I joined, I said, I know, I worked in your old department for 2 years. The table went quiet, not uncomfortably, just quiet. Callum, to his credit, said nothing. He had known broadly who his father was, had mentioned him to me long before this dinner, casually, the way you mention a parent. He hadn't known I'd worked in his department. I hadn't known to connect the dots until Callum mentioned his father's full name about 6 months into our relationship, at which point I'd said, very quietly, oh, and Callum had said, what? And I'd said, nothing, I'll tell you sometime. And then had not told him for another 2 years, because it had felt like something that would be a bigger deal than I wanted it to be. It had, in fact, turned out to be a bigger deal. Gordon was quiet for a moment. Then he said, carefully, what did you think of the work we were doing there when you joined? And I want to be honest about this. I want to be careful here, because the easy answer would have been flattering, and the completely honest answer would have been complicated, and what I actually said was the true thing, which was somewhere in between. I thought the structural rigor was exceptional, I said. There was a methodology embedded in how that department worked that I've carried with me into everything I've done since. The way projects were reviewed, the accountability to the building physics. I've never worked anywhere that took those things as seriously. He was listening very carefully. And, he said, and I thought some of the aesthetic conservatism was costing the firm commissions it deserved to win. That's not a criticism of the engineering. It's just the world was changing, and some of the design leadership wasn't moving with it. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That's fair." "Just that? That's fair." Irene was looking at him with an expression I couldn't quite read. Fond, maybe, or surprised, or both. "There was a competition," Gordon said slowly, "for a transit hub in Mississauga. The year I left, we didn't win it." "I know the project," I said. "I worked on the postmortem." He looked at me. "The consensus was that the proposal was technically excellent and aesthetically conservative," I said. "The client wanted something that would photograph well for the next 25 years. The winning proposal understood that. Ours didn't." I say ours because it was my post-mortem and my report, even though I was 26 years old and 3 months into the job. The senior architect who read my notes had said without much expression, "You're not wrong," and filed them away. Nothing changed, but I wasn't wrong. Gordon nodded slowly. He was looking at the table, not at me, but it didn't feel like evasion. It felt like thinking. "I used to argue," he said, "that buildings should outlast trends, that you shouldn't design for the decade you're in." "I think you can do both," I said. "I think the best work does both. It's contextual and it lasts. Those aren't contradictory." "Maybe not." A pause. "The Guelph project is contextual?" "I hope so. It'll need to serve people for the next 40 years. So we made decisions for 40 years, not for the award cycle." "And you got the award anyway." "Shortlisted," I said. "We didn't win." He smiled. It was the first real smile I'd seen from him, not a polite one, not a social one, but a genuine one. "Who won?" "A firm in Vancouver. Very good project. They deserved it." "Are you always this measured?" he said. Callum made a sound that was not quite a laugh. "Only when I have something to prove," I said. There was a pause. Then Gordon said quietly, "You don't, you know. Have something to prove, not here." I didn't know what to say to that. It landed somewhere unexpected. Not in my chest exactly, but close. I'd spent the better part of the evening quietly defending my legitimacy without wanting to seem like I was doing that. And to have him say plainly that I didn't need to was the last thing I'd expected. "Thank you," I said. It came out simpler than I intended, but sometimes simple is the right thing. Irene brought out dessert, butter tarts, which I would later learn was something Callum had specifically requested because he knew I loved them, a detail that made me feel, in the middle of all of this, absurdly cared for. Gordon asked about the Scarborough Recreation Center, not in a probing way, in the way of someone who was genuinely curious and had decided to be. We talked for almost an hour after the main course, about public buildings, about what they owe the communities they sit in, about how you design for people who don't have the vocabulary to tell you what they need but know it when they feel it. He disagreed with me on a few things. I disagreed with him on a few things. It was, genuinely, one of the better architectural conversations I'd had in years. At one point, Irene refilled everyone's tea and said, to no one in particular, "I'm very glad you two finally came for dinner." On the drive back to Toronto, we took the QEW, the lake going dark on one side of us. Callum drove and I looked out the window and said nothing for a while. "So," he said finally. "So," I agreed. "You worked in his department for 2 years and you didn't tell me." "I didn't put it together until you told me his name." "And then you didn't tell me for another 2 years." "I was waiting for the right moment." He was quiet then. Was tonight the right moment? It turned out to be. He laughed, a real one. I loved his laugh. I'd loved it for 2.5 years. "He liked you," Callum said. "He was skeptical of me for most of the meal." "That's how he shows interest. If he didn't like you, he would have asked you about the weather and then talked to me about hockey for the rest of the night." I thought about Gordon's face when I told him where I'd worked, the way his expression had moved through something. Surprise, recalibration, something I can only describe as a kind of recognition. I hadn't told him who I was to score a point. I want to be clear about that, because it might look that way from the outside. I told him because he asked a direct question and I answered it honestly, and the truth happened to be surprising. I've spent enough of my career managing the surprise of being younger than people expect, or less experienced than they've assumed, or a woman in rooms that haven't historically had many of them, to know the difference between defending yourself and simply being accurate. I was being accurate, What I didn't expect was for him to receive it the way he did. Without defensiveness, without retreating into the authority of his age or his experience or the decades he'd spent building things I admired, he just adjusted, listened, asked better questions. That takes something. I know it does. I've watched people fail to do it my entire career. Men, mostly, but not only men. People who have been right for so long that being wrong, or even being uncertain, has become unbearable. Gordon was not that. Or maybe he had been once and had grown out of it. I didn't know him well enough to say. I just knew that when I told him quietly that I thought some of the aesthetic conservatism had cost the firm work it deserved, he had said that's fair and moved on, not conceded everything, not collapsed, just acknowledged what was true and kept going. I thought about that for most of the drive home. Callum's hand found mine somewhere around Burlington. Outside, the 407 stretched ahead of us, the city beginning to gather itself on the horizon. "Your mom is lovely," I said. "She'll be insufferable now," he said. "She's been asking about you for 1.5 years." "What did you tell her?" "That you were busy." That was true. Also that you were the most competent person I'd ever met and that I was slightly intimidated by you for the first 3 months. I turned to look at him. He was watching the road. "You never told me that." "I'm telling you now." I looked back at the highway. The city was all lights in the distance, the kind of skyline I'd grown up looking at and still couldn't entirely take for granted, even after everything, even after all the years of learning how it got built, piece by piece, compromise by compromise, argument by argument. "I think I'll go back," I said. "To Oakville?" "To dinner, with your parents, if that's—" "Yes," he said. No pause, no hesitation, just yes. There's a version of that evening I could tell that would be tidier. Girl meets intimidating father, stands her ground, wins him over with one great line. Everyone applauds. But that's not quite what happened. What happened was messier and slower and more human than that. Gordon didn't become someone different by the end of dinner. I didn't win anything. We just talked, really talked for the first time and discovered that we had things to say to each other that were worth saying. I've thought about it since, the way he received the conversation. The way he didn't perform certainty when he no longer had it. I'd like to do the same when it's my turn. When I'm the one at the table who's been in the field longer and someone younger is sitting across from me with work I haven't seen yet, I'd like to remember what it felt like to be accurately underestimated, and I'd like to be better than that. I think I'll try. I've been thinking about that dinner for weeks now, not the moment Gordon found out, though that moment was significant, but what came after it. The way he said that's fair and just kept going. No deflection, no retreat into the armor of seniority, just 2 words and then a better question. That's harder than it looks. I know because I've watched people fail to do it my entire career. There's something that happens to a person after years of being the most experienced one in the room. A kind of calcification, where being right stops feeling like a position and starts feeling like an identity. And when that happens, being challenged doesn't feel like information anymore. It feels like a threat. Gordon could have been that person. He had every credential to justify it. 30 years of serious work, a reputation that still lived in the institutional memory of a firm I had passed through. He'd earned the right to hold his opinions firmly. But he hadn't confused earning that right with being exempt from updating. That's the thing I keep coming back to. Integrity. Real integrity, not the performative kind, isn't about never being wrong. It's about what you do when you find out you were. Whether you protect your position or whether you protect the truth. Gordon protected the truth. He adjusted. He asked better questions. That took something from him and I respect him for it. I also think about what it cost me to sit quietly through the first hour of that dinner. Not dramatically, it wasn't a trauma. But there's a specific kind of patience required when someone is confidently wrong about a field you've spent your adult life inside, and you have to decide how and when to say so. I've made that calculation hundreds of times. In client meetings, in review panels, in rooms where I was the youngest person and the only woman and the one with the most hours logged on the actual project. You learn after a while that timing matters. That there's a version of being right that closes the conversation and a version that opens it. I tried to open it. I think it worked. And I think about Callum, too, sitting beside me the whole evening, his hand finding my knee at exactly the right moment, not jumping in to explain me, or defend me, or translate me, just being there. That's its own kind of steadiness. He trusted me to handle it. He trusted his father to come around. He turned out to be right on both counts, and I think that says something about how well he knows both of us. There's a version of that evening that ends differently, where Gordon doubles down, where I go quiet, where we drive back to Toronto in a silence that takes months to thaw. It could have gone that way. These things often do. What prevented it wasn't cleverness or luck. It was that both of us were willing to stay in the discomfort long enough for something real to happen. That takes discipline. It takes the kind of honesty that doesn't reach for approval, and the kind of resilience that doesn't reach for the exit when things get complicated. I don't always get that right. I'm trying to.